I had no idea they were going to read that. Kind of steals my thunder a little bit. What I put together today is what I call scaling customer success, but I'll tell you it's not. I watched Nick Mehta do his customer success speech with True University 2 years ago, and it was so much metrics that if you've not been in customer success for a very long time, I can imagine it was overwhelming. I also recognize the fact that we've been here for 2 days already, and you're probably starting to wane in your energy, and so this section will be a little bit interactive. So, yep, that's me. I've been doing this since way before Mark Benioff even said he had customer success managers. We started in 2002 right out of law school and have worked with various different size companies, anywhere from startup to Cisco WebEx. We got acquired by Cisco about 2.5 years into my time there. And what I will tell you is that, based on my experience in the various different organizations I've been in, customer success scales across every single vertical. And one of those is actually a on-prem solution, Advent, and they sold $1 million deals for financial services. It even works there. And so you're in the right place, doing the right thing for your customers. As she mentioned, I've done a ton of different things, not just CSM, that's where I started, but I've done support and sales chat, and so I have a comprehensive view of what the customer lifecycle actually looks like inside an organization. All right, so here's my spiel about it's late in the day. I'm making some assumptions. It's late in the day, you've been here for 2 days, you're probably getting tired. People don't really like to be talked at because we know that you only absorb about 7 to 10% of what I'm gonna say if I talk at you the whole time. And that connecting with others is actually what I believe to be the most important skill in our business and in our market. So what I'm gonna ask you to do during this session is I handed out some papers. I have 3 things I'm going to talk about. At the end of each one of those, I'll give you a case study usually, and then I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor. And I want you to turn to a different neighbor each time, preferably, because the best thing you can do, and what I find about customer success, is network, because there are no right answers for this. There are what's the best answer for you, and people do it a gazillion different ways. Okay, fair? All right. I will try not to talk really fast. I tend to do that. So please do let me know, raise your hand and say, hey, slow down if I'm talking too fast and you can't understand me. So I'll start with the general, which is everybody loves customer success, right? It's the buzzword everywhere. And just like Nick said 2 years ago, people are starting to change their titles to customer success from all kinds of different things just because they work with customers. But the reality is that just because you work with a customer isn't a customer success, but there are lots of things to be excited about in terms of customer success. I've got 2 different surveys on here. If any of you know Alex Rosen over at McKinsey, he's recently done a survey about customer success and client experience. And so these first 2 bullets come from him. If done right, the customer success function is often the catalyst for the end-to-end transformation. And I'll stop here and give my little giggle about this. I consider customer success managers to be cat herders. It isn't your job to fix all the issues, but it is your job to know what issues need to be fixed and then to rally the people around how to actually fix those issues. And he does believe the same kind of thing. It is an end-to-end transformation. It doesn't just start because you get a customer. It starts actually before that because customer success managers can actually teach you which customers work best with your service. And all the way to the end in terms of renewals, even if you don't own the actual signing of the document that gets them back in the house. 95% of the people in that survey said that it was top 2 box correlation to revenue. Period. That's it. That's enough. And even if you're not aligned to revenue from an adoption perspective, from a renewal or an upsell perspective, you do impact the revenue, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. The average uplift that they saw from customer success on usage, retention, things like that was about 20%. And if you think about that in terms of millions of dollars, at WebEx we could move the revenue, the retention by 1%, and that was millions and millions of dollars because we had so many customers. So even incremental changes make a big difference. Totango does this thing called the Customer Success State of the Union or something akin to that. In 2016, they said 50% of now CSM organizations are reporting into CEOs as opposed to 15% in years past, which is huge. That means the C-level suite is actually beginning to understand that customer success is just as valid as all the others, marketing and sales and things like that. And that 80% of the teams have grown. I am the product of one of those teams has not grown. My experience at Hightail, and I'll tell you about that, they decided to not do enterprise business, and so they laid off everyone, all the CSMs, all the product managers, everything related to enterprise. That's not the standard. The standard actually is most of the organizations are growing like crazy, and we can't find people because there aren't enough people to do the job. But there are some challenges even with all that great stuff. Some of the challenges are this profession really is about 20 years old. I said I've been doing it for about 21 years. We called it client services or account management back there. It's about 20 years old. If you look at all the other functions within an organization, most of them are way older than that. Marketing's been around forever, sales has been around forever, product marketing has been around forever, engineering certainly has. Customers either expect a high level of service because we have coddled them in the very beginning, or they expect no service at all. My experience in building out CSM organizations, with me being the first CSM, I've walked in and had to convince customers that they really did want to talk to me because they were so used to not actually having someone talk to them. CSMs are, and I did a talk about this at Totango's summit a couple years ago, they really are the unicorns of the corporate world. They're expected to do so many different things that it's hard to scale, it's hard to hire them and to actually scale. And what we find also is that the average CSM leadership team is young in terms of experience because there aren't a lot of people who've been doing this. The average age or experience of a CSM in organizations is less than 3 years these days. And so when you say, yes, I may have 10 years worth of professional experience, but only 3 of that's been in CSM, on the leader side, it's closer to 7 to 10 years that they've been actually leading CSM teams. And if you think about that, that's infantile. That's nothing compared to some of the other ones. Measuring CSM impact is hard. I will not go into metrics today. You can go watch Nick's from 2 years ago. It hasn't changed that much in terms of metrics. But measuring the impact is hard and takes longer because unlike sales where you can get a button seat and you've got a territory and within 2 months you're expecting to sell something, CSMs take a long time to uncover the issues, solve the issues that have been in place for many, many months, quarters, if not years, before the CSM gets to them. And so even if you make a change of a couple of points of retention, that usually is after 9 to 12 months is what we're finding. It takes at least that long. And then unlike sales, there are no real functions, and I talked a little bit about this also. The processes are all over the place. I was at a CCO dinner a year and a half ago that Gainsight put on, and their major question for us at the table was, what is customer success? There are 8 leaders, Salesforce and Optimizely and myself, who was at Glassdoor at the time, and a couple of other leaders at the table, and no one did the same exact thing. Some of them had CSMs who had revenue impact, were doing some minor upsells and retention. I had an entire team of support, operations, CSM, all those folks. Some of them had CSMs who did nothing but actual adoption, and so we can't really even agree on what this profession is yet. But there are a couple of things that we do agree on, and that's how to scale. So these 3 points I'll talk about today, fairly simple in understanding them, not necessarily so easy to deploy. So the first of which is hiring CSMs and when the heck should you do that stuff. And then how much should they manage? And those two things are really intimately connected. The second thing is segmenting accounts. And we know marketing has been doing this forever and sales has technically been doing this forever, but a spin on customer success on how to do that. And the last thing is creating this account coverage model or define the roles and responsibilities for your customers along the way to make sure they meet their needs. Okay? That's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into that, I would love to have some idea of who you guys are. So everybody in customer success here? If you are, raise hand. Okay, vast majority. Sales? Marketing? Product? Okay, all right, did I hit everybody? Miss anybody? Okay, what size company are you guys at? Are you 50 and below employees? Yes? 100 and below? Are we up to 500? Mostly early stage, okay. All right, one last question. What's your number of customers? Are we 100 and below customers? Nice, those are hard. 500 and below customers? Couple thousand? All right, so we're somewhere around the middle, okay. So this will make sense for you guys. I assume that each one of you has at least one CSM in your organization, is that true? Yes? Okay, that's why you're here, all right. All right. So I went about this from the perspective of you've got one CSM and now you want to hire some additional CSMs. So let's talk about that. Have you guys ever seen this chart that Gainsight puts out? And if you do not know about Gainsight, Gainsight is one of the customer success analytic platforms that are out there. I'm not advocating you buy one or the other, by the way. There's another big one called Totango, another one called Client Success, I think. They are all agnostic to me, although I have purchased Gainsight 4 times. The thing I like about Gainsight, actually, is that Gainsight is very much a thought leader in this space. They created this product about 6 or 7 years ago, way back when they were called JBara, and They knew that customer success wasn't as developed as it needed to be for that product to be successful. Likens me back to Okta. I had a conversation with Okta probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And Okta at the time was way ahead of the market because nobody knew what single sign-on was and we didn't care. And so instead of having to deal with the technical difficulties of Okta, Gainsight said, hey, we'll just be the thought leaders in the space. And so if you're interested in customer success information, go to Gainsight's blog. No joke. There's smart people over there, okay? So what this is what they consider to be a function of a CSM. And they look at it from 2 different perspectives. One is product complexity, the other one is business maturity. And so most of us in this area, and even across the United States, are firefighter CSMs. And when I say firefighter CSMs, it's do all the things, put all the fires out. And that isn't necessarily as proactive as we'd like them to be, because when they get to be more proactive, they can actually make an impact on the revenue. When they're a firefighter, what they're doing is just swallowing a whole bunch of water and trying to keep everyone afloat, okay? And so there are some good things about being a firefighter CSM. I want to acknowledge that because I've been in several organizations where that's the truth. The first of which is the CSM is a one-stop shop. So customers, the experience is great because they know exactly, they have one throat to choke. They need to go to me. Coca-Cola went to me with Hightail. They knew everything that I would take care of it. And I went back to them and took care of it. There is also a clear definition of roles because there's not really any roles. They just go to that one person and it's not such a big deal. So that leads to actually what most of the times is excellent customer experience if you don't have them inundated with 1,000 customers, okay? Let me put that caveat out there. But the con is that usually if they're doing all the things, it's extremely difficult for them to own revenue. They don't have the time to close the renewal. They don't have the time to evaluate whether there's a growth opportunity or not. They're just putting out the fires. It is really, really hard to hire this kind of a person because they have to have so many different skills. They have technical skills and support skills and finance skills and adoption skills. And on top of that, attrition is high. And if you guys are here in the Bay, certainly, it's hard to hire a CSM. Every single organization and most of my colleagues that I've worked with over the past 20 years are hiring CSMs. And so it's almost like they're pulling from each other and CSMs are reaping the benefit from it because their now salaries are really high compared to where they used to be. And I heard a quote the other day that there are some companies in the Bay who are paying $165,000 base for a CSM. I know. And they take off because if someone offers them $10,000 or $15,000 more, the grass looks like it's greener on that side, even though we know that money is not really a motivator for these kind of people. They're motivated by making issues go away. And it's really, really difficult to scale because while you can forecast your base, the revenue that's coming in, the number of customers based upon what sales is actually saying, what you can't forecast is how much support that individual customer is going to need. Maybe that one's going to be much more hands-on and needs to have all their support tickets taken care of. This one has a complex implementation and onboarding process, and you can't forecast on that stuff. Okay, so now that we acknowledge that most of us are firefighter CSMs, about 80% or so, Jason Lemkin, who's over at SaaStr, he does a bunch of blogging. He got some head waves. He wrote this blog about 2 years ago called The $2 Million Man or Woman. And this basically is how you scale from a CSM perspective. And so he looked at the deal size and he looked at whether they're reactive or proactive in the number of accounts. Now, I'll tell you that I have forecasted based upon number of accounts, and we'll talk about that when I talk about Glassdoor in the next couple slides. It's easier to do it from a revenue perspective. So if you can do revenue, not number of accounts. But what he said was these $5 to $20 a month customers only really need customer support. And so if that's what your business is, then don't worry about CSM. There's no real reason to have that. And you start getting up into the 5,000 ACV, there's about 400 accounts around that if you're aligning to his $2 million model. And those folks are kind of proactive and kind of reactive. I will tell you they're most reactive if you give a customer success manager that many accounts. All the way on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have 5 to 20 accounts at $100,000 a piece, and we all love those huge deals because they feel like they're better, but they are a lot to support. That's really when your CSM starts to be proactive because they only have a couple of different businesses that they have to know and a couple of different contacts they're actually working with, or main contacts anyways. Now back to Gainsight. Gainsight actually believes it's a little bit more complex than just saying $2 million and do your business. So they look at org growth, and they also look at business stage. And so from a low growth perspective and a late stage, yes, $2 million works. Advent was financial services on-prem solution. 32 years in business, SEC regulated, trade your stuff, that kind of stuff on Wall Street. Super easy for me to give my CSMs $2 million worth of business because they had 1 or 2 contacts in each one of those and large accounts, and it wasn't such a big deal for them to actually support them. They did have, it was complexity of product, but easier to do it that way. On the other end of the spectrum, at Hightail, we had millions of customers that we were converting to enterprise, and so I walked into 1,800 customers. There was no way with me, myself, I could handle 1,800 customers, even though that may have been $6 million at the time, okay? There are also some variables to think about when you're thinking about aligning CSMs. Do they own the revenue? Is it retention based that they're being measured on, or can they identify and grow that base? Are they doing onboarding, the proper training for customers? Are they doing support or professional services? Are they doing collections? Lots of organizations, CSMs do some collections. And then how manual is the process for supporting? And so I'll talk about that actually with my experience here. Welcome to my team at Glassdoor. I had started out with about 48 on the team, about 20 of which were actually CSMs. Those CSMs had anywhere from 90 to 350 accounts apiece. Anywhere their customers in their base, $10,000 in revenue to $400 or so thousand dollars in revenue. They were not CSMs. They were glorified support reps. All they did was take stuff from sales and answer the customer's questions. We evaluated their bases, and I went to my CEO, who was, if any of you guys know Glassdoor, it's Robert Homan, who was one of the founders of Expedia. And so he has lots of consumer experience and not so much on the business side, and so he didn't quite get CSM, even though he got it enough to hire me and hire these people on the team. But when you start getting into the complexity of the information that we needed him to understand, it was a little bit more difficult. So went to him and said, hey, here's the typical SaaS-based model. Now Glassdoor, you guys probably know, is reviews, salaries, consumer content, but on the opposite side is actually a jobs engine that's working. And the branding. So you buy the Glassdoor profile, you get to update it more, that kind of stuff. And I said, look, let's go with a SaaS model. Let's try number of accounts because of the complexity of actually what we're doing. The branding side of the house is very nascent. Our customers don't understand it. We're working with HR, as much as we love them, a little bit behind the times in terms of technology. And the tools that they have actually do not allow them to scale. And so if any of you guys are in media, one of the products is a job-based media product, which allowed them to go do cost per click and budgets and all that other stuff they had to manually take care of. He looked at me and said, you're crazy. Go with a media-based CSM. Go with $2 to $5 million. So I went, okay, we're going to try this. Went with $2 million, 90 accounts. Soon that grows really, really quickly, and now they're managing about $4 million a piece. And they're doing it manually. So we went back to him and said, look, it's not working. When I left, they were changing it to 70 accounts, or about $1.5 million based upon the complexity of the service and things like that. Okay? All right, so that's my Glassdoor experience. Now I have something for you guys. So again, most of you have the handout that I have. The second page actually, is the slide that Gainsight put together in terms of growth and stage of company and the amount of revenue. And what I would really, really like you guys to do is turn to somebody and have a conversation about how you actually fall in that scale. Where are you? And are there factors that you need to be considering in terms of CSMs, their variables, so to speak, that they are doing that may take them out of that? So I'll give you about 5 minutes to do that, and then I would love someone to raise their hand and talk about theirs. Can I get a volunteer to share what they talked about? Volunteer? Oh, come on. You're not all that shy. All right, perfect. Thank you.
So we have 3 of us from Handshake here. We're a recruiting platform for university students. And I think we mostly have firefighter CSMs right now. We have about 6 total, so not just the lonely, but mostly fighting fires, focusing on implementation, kind of glorified support.
Do you have an implementation function outside of the CSMs?
No. Okay. We do have a couple of solutions architects focused on that, but mostly CSMs cover that. And some of the variables or criteria or factors we consider, we do tiering based on university ranking. So it's a little different, not necessarily focused only on revenue, which makes it a little interesting. And then we're also looking at time spent per clients, and customer satisfaction and
Good, perfect. Okay, thank you for sharing. All right, let's go on to the next part, because now that you have a CSM or you're going to hire another CSM, you need to figure out how to segment customers. And my beginning shtick on this is marketing's been doing it forever, you guys. And they do it based upon the buying propensity of a customer as well as personas. And it's worked for them, but it's been challenging for us recently to do segmentation. And the reason why it's been challenging to do segmentation is that oftentimes we're aligned to the sales segmentation. And so as we were talking about, it was around the university size. In most organizations, sales is around the employee size. It is around the revenue that company can make or is making at the time, and actually the spend with us. And while that works somewhat, it's a little bit challenging. Let's go back to, I'll talk about Hightail in a minute, but at Hightail, you spent $10,000 with me. It looks like you actually don't need any support, but there's an amazing amount of white space in a $10,000 customer because we've only just hit the ground and we need to land and expand. So we're doing what we call these days experience segmentation or customer needs segmentation, adoption-based, and it's more about what the customer's experience is and how we can get them to adopt the services. Because if you go back to the meaning of a CSM, it really is that person who's supposed to be getting them to adopt, utilize, grow, and retain. That's what we do, okay? And so some things that we consider when we talk about experience segmentation are the technical complexity of a product. If you have a really complex product, you probably want to put more customers in the customer success manager's hands than you do otherwise, okay? If you're in an industry that is brand new, for instance, the branding side of Glassdoor, nobody knew what branding was on an HR side in terms of like put your page out there and make sure your applicants are getting to that. So you have to consider the industry of your product. Customers' business maturity. How far are they? Did they just start 6 months ago? I was working with a customer that just started their business. Actually, one of my consulting customers just started their business 4 months ago. They're not mature at all, and so it's highly unlikely that they can take care of themselves with regard to customers and getting the products adopted. The business application of the product, and then business expansion areas, and I'll talk a little bit about that last one in terms of going out to other markets. But to get to that information, so I did this session with another consultant at Gainsight's Pulse recently, and we talked about segmentation based upon adoption. And the number one question we got was, okay, those are all great. We love to consider those, but how the heck do you get to that information? And the first one is always data, right? Like if there's data that you can use. And so from a Glassdoor perspective, sorry, I keep using them. They're on top of my mind because it was just recently. From a Glassdoor perspective, if we had someone who was in HR and who was trying to take care of the services for us, but they'd only been in HR for 2 years, they're very different than someone who'd been there for 15 years. And so measuring the tenure of experience for our contacts was important for us, okay? Because we knew we had to do more. So those kind of things get to. The other thing is customer experience mapping or customer journey mapping. And it's great. I love it. It's fun to get a whole bunch of people who are customer facing in a room and say, let's map out a customer experience and what does that look like? And if you see that there's a whole bunch of touch points or a whole bunch of touches that you have to have at the beginning of the experience right after they've been deployed or right after they've been sold, you know that you need a CSM who's an onboarding CSM. And you should segment those customers, the ones that are higher level. For instance, at Advent, we had a product which called Geneva. Geneva was extremely complex and took a lot of implementation, but then we had online products that were up just like most of you probably in this room. So they were up in a day or two. At WebEx, it took us 48 hours to get a product up, and that was basically it. And then have customer discussions. Lincoln Murphy, if you guys have heard about him, blogger, been in customer success for quite some time too, talks about actually going out to the customer and talking to them about what their actually needs are. What do you consider to be success? What are you really trying to do in terms of your goals? What do you like about the vendors in this space? What do you like about the product? What do you not like about the product? And getting information from them to help you with segmentation. Because if they say, hey, we struggle with this product, there's no other vendor who can actually do it, you probably want them aligned around the CSM. But if they're saying, no, I got this, then you probably don't need a CSM aligned around them, okay? All right, so here's the tricky part. I actually do not believe that it's only the experience mapping and segmentation. I actually believe that you have to pay deference to the value that that customer is to you, as well as to the experience of the customer. And that's tricky because sales wants you to go and do only one thing, and I want to go do this thing, and so how do we meet in the middle? And I will also say, when you define your segmentation for your customers, it's extremely, extremely important that you keep it simple. And I say this for two reasons. The first of which is that salesperson actually has to understand what level of experience your customer is going to have. And so if you tell them, and when I walked into Hightail, it was, employee count of 0 to 500 and revenue less than this and this long with us. And then employee count of this and this and this. I couldn't go to a salesperson and say, remember that customer only has an employee count of 500 and they've been with us for only 30 days. And then on top of that, they're only pulling in this amount of revenue. They would look at me like I was crazy. They would never be able to do that. Not on a regular basis, and certainly not at volume and scale. And so the more simple you keep it, the better you'll be, okay? Because they have to explain it to themselves, figure it out, and they have to explain it to the customer in terms of what level of service. So here's my Hightail experience. Hightail, do you guys know who Hightail is? Okay. You know, you send it? You send it. There we go. Okay. So You Send It has been around for quite some time, was a consumer company that did basically file sharing. And when you only do file sharing, you either need to share a big, huge file or you don't. There's no reason for customer success. So when I walked in there, I was the first CSM to walk in. There was about 1,800 accounts. And we looked at the base, and as I mentioned to you, it was a very complex sales segmentation structure that I just couldn't abide by because it didn't make any sense to me and for the customer. And so what we landed on was the revenue side of it needed to be white space because, for instance, we sold Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, we sold initially at about 20,000 licenses. They have somewhere near 80,000 knowledge workers at Coca-Cola. And so there was an immense amount of white space to be had at Coca-Cola. The other thing we looked at was use case because we introduced collaboration. And now collaboration, online collaboration is such a vague word these days. But for them, it was the exact same thing as Box and Dropbox. It was the folders and the sharing and that kind of stuff and working on documents together. But the base of customers that we were working with, Rockwell Automation and security firms and things like that, didn't get that. And so we needed to figure out whether they purchased the file sharing only or whether they purchased the online collaboration and what their value, how much they were using online collaboration. And so we segmented on that. I was talking to a former CSM of mine, and she had $10,000 customers in her base that had, immense amount of white space, and she had, $300,000 customers in her base. I myself managed Coca-Cola because they were so dang important to us. At the end of my time there, they were up to billing about $2.5 million a year and utilizing like crazy. And so what we did was look at the white space, and then we balanced that with a use case, and then we added in regional alignment, and I said I would talk about this. We decided to expand into APAC, in particular into Australia. I was the CSM who expanded into Australia with them. I went out there a couple times, spent a couple weeks at a time, talking to customers and figuring out what the heck they were trying to do with it. And what we found out actually was that those customers were about 4 or 5 years behind in the online collaboration space. They didn't get it at all, and they didn't care about it. What they really wanted was the file sharing because the internet speeds are extremely slow in Australia. Imagine being in the bush and literally we had mining companies as our customers and having to push a button to get something, and then you leave at night and in the morning you come in and it's still not sent because it's so big. That was the problem we were solving for them. And so for us, we had to also regionally align to make sure that someone understood that base. And I even had to go back to marketing and say, stop talking to them the way you're talking to the people in the US. They don't get it, they don't care. So you're missing the market completely. So that was my Hightail experience, but essentially we started adding a couple CSMs. When I left there, we only had 5, including myself. We took the retention from the salespeople except for those enterprise customers. I co-owned Coca-Cola's renewal with my sales guy. We revised the marketing message for APAC and essentially moved the retention from 76% to 93% in 13 months. And that was a huge amount of money. By the time I left Hightail, we were billing about $16 million on our enterprise space. So that was a couple million, okay? And CSMs were primarily responsible for those. Okay. All right, I have another exercise for you because energy is waning. All right, so using this information, I want you to talk about how you are segmenting your customers, and then which adoption parameters are you using or could you use to do that if you aren't currently doing that. Turn to someone new if you can. All right. Who wants to be the brave soul now? See, it was easy. Yes? Yeah.
So we're both from England, so
Okay.
when we first started, it was like definitely the firefighter aspect of it. And
Yeah.
the clients came in, they just got assigned. There wasn't a whole lot of rhyme or reason, but
Uh-huh.
since then, to your point, we've got different examples based on the revenue, geography, and aligning them with the appropriate time zone.
Uh-huh.
And then how much of a product you're buying, so full suite versus sections.
Okay.
Those are the 3, 4.
Okay. what adoption parameters could you use, or customer needs parameters? Because if you're talking about geography, yes, you want a CSM who's available and at their time. If you're talking about revenue, that's more of an internal facing. But what could you implement that would make a difference for the customers in terms of their needs based?
So we've talked about aligning like internal expertise on people coming from more like manufacturers and people with experience there versus retail versus finance. It's just we don't have the size at this point to really roll that out, but it's something that's important.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for sharing. I promise you guys we're almost done, and then you'll get on with your day. So we'll talk very quickly about account coverage models. So again, hire a CSM, segment your customers, and now suddenly what the heck do you do with your customers now that you have them segmented, because they're not completely firefighters because you've got a little bit of help. And so account coverage models, and I put this up here because one of the biggest issues facing customer success functions within organizations these days is tripping over other people who are working with a client. And this is one of those crazy Scotland, follow the cheese down the hill kind of things. And I love this because it totally is what it feels like in an organization to be a CSM, to go, wait, you're on my way, you already talked to the customer, we're all chasing the same kind of ball. And what I would love for you guys to do is actually get ahead of this and not have this happen, especially if you're a smaller organization. So we look at operational, I don't know why I ever use this word because there's always trip over it. We want to segment customers and put some process around it. How's that? So you want to use the information you gain during the segmentation of your customer. So all that information you know about their needs and their adoption and their goals and things like that to create what we call an intelligent customer lifecycle or touch points that you will then overlay with people internally who do jobs and talk to customers. That was not clear at all, it feels like. And so let me go to the next slide. This probably will help you. Customer touch points, examples of customer touch points that you put in place. And I'll show heavy touch life cycle next. But date-driven life cycle touches are onboarding. You know that when you sell a customer, you've got to do onboarding. You know that you're going to do a business reviews. Whether you do that every 60 days, every 90 days, every quarter, every 6 months, doesn't matter. You've got to do business reviews with large customers. And you know that customer is eventually going to renew or come back and buy again. Issue-driven are those things like support, like break fixes, bugs, and how-to. I need to, from a usability perspective, know what the heck to do with this. And then what I call event-driven, which is health change. So if you have a health score for a customer, they're green, suddenly they're yellow or they're red. Your sponsor changes. Number one risk to business organizations right now in terms of customers, you lose your contact. Please be aware of that. Because if you only have one contact and they go, guess what? You're reselling. And usually it takes a long time to actually resell. And so get ahead of that, by the way, just a side note, and go get a whole bunch of different contacts, put different people on different contacts. And then if you're deploying a new product, that's an event-driven based touch point life cycle. Now, here's an example of a high-touch coverage model. It doesn't have everything in it that it possibly could, but this looks like a typical adoption cycle for a customer. You sell it, you onboard, you adopt, you get advanced usage, you grow, and then you renew. That's typical. But what's not typical are all the things that happen around that. And so, for instance, a kickoff happens. But when does that happen? Who does that? You build out the product. At Glassdoor, it was a team who implemented it, but they didn't talk to the customer. They just built the technical aspect of it. You do onboarding training. At Glassdoor, we didn't do that at all. And that was one of our big issues that we were implementing when I was leaving. You need an executive sponsor update. You have a QBR or executive business review. Your sponsor changes that I mentioned. There's an upsell or health change or support escalation. And then finally, you renew that contract. And so when you talk about coverage models, you really want to understand who should be responsible for these based upon their skill set. That's what I'm really saying. That's why I want to go through these couple of slides. So if you look at the two different skill sets, major skill sets of folks who actually proactively reach out to customers and trip over each other on a regular basis, it's sales and it's CS. And so in the middle, what I tend to look at is what's their focus area, what's their expansion skills, their technical or product knowledge, what's their domain knowledge, and then a little bit about compensation and structure and variable, because that's important when you're talking about even if the sales rep could actually do support escalations, are they the right person to do it if they're making that much money or they're not making that much money? So you have to consider those things too. And so if you go down this list, you'll notice sales is ROI and data focused. They're hunters, their product knowledge is usually, or technical knowledge is usually low to mid. They're advisory in nature, but CSMs are consultative. They're really like, tell me all the things so I can figure out what actually to do. They tend to be farmers and not hunters. Most CSMs I know can sell a product, but they choose not to do that because they don't love that quota hanging over their head. but they are really, really good at talking to a customer and uncovering that. Their product knowledge usually and their technical knowledge, depending upon the complexity of the service, is usually mid to high. I have worked with CSMs who are extremely technical in nature, and going back to the Okta, one of the things that Hightail did was a single sign-on integration, and so I had to know all about forests in their Active Directory. That's way over my head mostly. And then their relationship and people focused. So here's our discussion, and rather than turn to each other, I would like to just have this conversation with you guys. What touches do you currently have scheduled or you know that occur with customers? Just blurt out a couple. Implementation call? Onboarding? Optimization, great. Check-in. What's a check-in? Okay. Okay. What's service recovery? Okay. Okay. All right. So of those people who answered me on that, who takes care of those? And based upon their skill set, should they? Yes, sir?
Well, right now we have implementation managers, but that even goes again to the products that they are buying.
Okay.
So we have an implementation manager, and then we have a benefits consultant, and then a payroll consultant, and then they also can get another benefits consultant if they get paid. So there's a lot of
You've got lots of people working on that.
yeah, so
Yes.
there's a lot of happening to work with when we talk about how we can. That's a lot of line of cohort model to be able to.
Smart. Smart. Okay. Who else answered me and wants to say who takes care of those? Who?
Our CSMs take care of onboarding.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Our account managers do both the implementation as well as the check and the kickoff and the check-in.
Define account manager for me.
In general, or my organization?
No, yours.
It's basically line of customer success. It's the person in charge of implementation, establishing, proactively checking in the customer as opposed to reactive breakdowns.
Why do they do the QBRs?
Because they already have a relationship with the customer and they understand their needs.
Okay. Do any of you guys do EBRs or QBRs? Yes? Do customer success managers take care of those for you? Yes? Okay. There are some organizations where, and the reason why I ask what's an account manager is that, of course, customer success manager, client services, account manager, sometimes account manager sales. At Glassdoor, the account manager was the sales, and they actually took care of the QBR. And we were fighting against that model because I do actually believe that CSMs are the ones who have the most information about the account, and it's easiest to do a QBR that way. When you do it from a sales perspective, then they're always looking for a sale. And with CSM, we'll look for a sale if you tell them to look for a sale, but it doesn't feel like to the customer that that's their sole goal. Okay. Anyone else want to answer? Yes.
You went on the optimization for the CSM and the sales guy actually are partners, they will be on the call together.
What's your service, by the way?
And we offer like cloud-based log management solution.
Okay. Is the salesperson the right person to have on that?
No.
Okay, yeah, see? And so you end up having sales, and this is our exact problem at Glassdoor, which was here they are doing QBRs, aren't identifying a lot of opportunity. In fact, our growth rate at that point on existing customers on the enterprise side was only about 35%, which is good, but not where we would like it to have been. That's because they were doing all these things they shouldn't have been doing instead of actually going and digging more dirt or finding new customers or or finding more contacts within the customer organization. And so those are the kind of questions that we want you to ask is like, should they be doing it? Are they the right skills? And what could they be doing if they weren't doing that? So, all right, I am almost done. That was an abrupt end, but I know it's getting late and it's warm in here because I feel it in the jacket. So we talked about hiring CSMs and the parameters for that in terms of standard of $2 million per CSM, but there are all these operational variables. We talked about segmenting an account and balancing the sales and value of the customer and the adoption or customer experience. And we also talked about this account coverage model, which is align your skill sets to the touch points that you actually need. You can do huge, customer journey mapping workshops and things like that to actually do many of your different personas and then map the people on top of that are support, implementation, sales, all the different people who work on customers and organizations. I will leave you with one concept, and that is that customer success is not a set it and forget it function. I don't foresee this being the case anytime soon. And when I say that, so, going back to the Glassdoor example, we aligned them to $2 million worth of business, 90 accounts, and then we worked on that for about 9, 12 months, and then suddenly we looked back and went, that didn't work. Let's go change. Now, the converse of that is also true. Don't change really fast so that you actually are not getting the data around why you would want to change, but realize that you're going to iterate through these things many, many, many times, and that's okay. As long as you're learning from them, and as long as your customer is getting better and better, better in their alignment to you, iterating through them is okay. All right, questions? Yes?
You said something about an 80-20 rule in terms of compensation for CSMs, but I don't know if everyone else knows that, but I don't know what the deal is for that.
CSMs are typically compensated on a base salary about 80%, sometimes 75% and sometimes 85%, but typically about 80%. And then about 10% of 20% of their compensation package is a variable. And they are comped usually on things that are MBO based. So how's your retention doing your base, a percentage of retention? Are you working on projects? How many actual customers, strategic touch points do you have?
And for a small stage company hiring a first or second CSM, do you propose that kind of comp structure?
Yes, yes. But first determine what kind of CSM you want, because if you've got a CSM who's going to be responsible for lots of revenue, that's more of a sales-based CSM. And so you can slide that base salary scale down to 65-70% and then make the rest of their compensation variable, depending upon what they do. So just be careful where that's concerned. But most adoption-based, 80-20 is good.
And Gainsight, like where's the more place to get this? Like
Gainsight, Gainsight blog, seriously. Totango has some information, but Gainsight has a whole plethora of people who write for them, including Lincoln Murphy and Allison Pickens, their CCO, and Dan Steinman, their CCO in Europe. Yes?
What is the difference between an account manager and
That's a great question, and it depends on how you term them. Account managers are, for me, have always been the people who are on the sales side doing the growth and the retention. And that's basically all they're doing is the growth and retention. But there's some debate in the community that account managers and CSMs should be the same thing. But the problem where you start to work with retention and upsell and closing deals is CSMs are not really good at that usually. They don't negotiate well, and that's a skill that we all need to learn. And then B, if you take them off of the adoption base and put them on revenue base and you start talking to the customers about revenue, now the customer doesn't talk to you as a trusted advisor, and so you don't get all those growth opportunities that you would get if they weren't. So the difference truly is like whether they're closing a deal on the sales side and whether they're not and they're just adoption. Yeah. But people would argue with me on that because there's so many different models, yes?
how would you suggest transitioning from like an account manager to CSM? Like what is that?
A handoff from like they sell it and then they move to CSM, or what's the question?
I guess how much overlap do you see from the account manager and CSM? Do you they continue to work together?
They continue to work together. Yes, in the best situations that I have worked in, we have worked together as a team. And so for instance, if I go back to Coca-Cola and even customer we had, Rockwell Automation, the sales rep on them, he called himself an account executive because he sold new and existing deals. When I first walked in, he'd never worked with a CSM. He was probably 65 or so. Southern gentleman was like, I don't know what the heck you're trying to do here, but don't come and touch my accounts. Literally for the first 60 days, was like, you may not talk to them. And he had Coca-Cola and these big guys on his side, JWT and those kind of things. After listening to me with other customers, he began to trust me, and he started putting me even in a pre-sales aspect. And so he would send the contract out to the customer and say, now that you've got the contract, here's Anjanette. She's going to be the person who supports you. And I would get on the phone without him even on the phone, and I would say, hey, let's talk about your business. What are you trying to do? Here's what David has told me. Here are all the things that are going to need to be done for an implementation for you, and I'm going to start the implementation already, so that we can, when we hit the ground after you send that contract back, because I know you're going to do that, that we're already implementing the services. And so for instance, with Rockwell Automation, he left me to all the communication, adoption, all of those kind of things. And I literally would go back to him and say, okay, so now Andy, who's the contact at Rockwell Automation, Andy's now at 6,000 users, was at 4,000. You need to call Andy, he needs an upsell. And he would literally pick up the phone and go, I see you have 6,000 users. You've been doing really great with Anjanette. How about another 2,000 that you owe us? And when we got to the point where at the end of that situation, and I'm still friends with Andy actually, they were at 16,000 users and he was selling them an enterprise agreement. And it was literally like me doing all the adoption communication internally, and then he would jump in when I need him to come sell something. But you have to have, we had monthly account planning sessions to sit down and go, here are all the accounts, here are all the problems I have with accounts, and here's the risk. I'll do that, you do that, because we're aligned on skill sets on those. If I need a new contact, it was always David who did it. And here's all the growth opportunity. I can continue to go do this, and you need to go do this. But we had those monthly on Rockwell Automation because it's such a big account for us. You can do it quarterly too, and that's what I typically tell my CSMs is go do it quarterly. Sit down with your sales rep that you're aligned to and go over your accounts and go here are the risk and here are the opportunities. Who owns what? Yeah.
Have you encountered situations where customers get confused over when they should contact their CSM versus support? And if so, how do you handle that?
Yeah, that picture that I showed is true of every customer-facing person in the organization, right? And so it is really about how do you set that expectation up front. And usually what I do is in my implementation and onboarding cycle is send out an email, welcome, we love you, by the way, here are the people that you have the capability of interacting with. The CSM is responsible for this, the support person is responsible for this, and if you can't get a hold of your CSM and it's an everyday usability question, support can be that person for you. So it's easier when you set expectations up front with customers where everything is concerned. And then if you can't do that up front because you have existing legacy customers, what I tend to do is do that during QBR sessions of like, look, we have had 15 support tickets, and by the way, they went to the CSM instead of support, and as a result, it was delayed because CSM then has to go to support and do it. So put them back in a place where they understand why it's important that they go to the right person, and usually I do that in the QBRs and EBRs. Yeah. We have 5 minutes left. Yes?
We talked about hiring the next CSM.
Yeah.
Can you, based on your experience, suggest on like which functions in the company must definitely participate in interviewing that next CSM?
Absolutely. There are a couple of functions in the company that are integral because they work with them on a regular basis. Product marketing for me is one of the highest because we have to filter the information back to product marketing to say who is the right customer, who's not the right customer. Product is absolutely high. I was talking to Jason here about the fact that we really are that loop. And so they have to understand that they need to be talking to product. And I always integrate sales because we are such close partners. So those three are my go-tos. I will occasionally bring in support, but that depends on how much I think they need to be working with support, how many support tickets the customer does, but usually it's those three. Yeah. Yes? The question was, I mentioned that about 50% of CSM organizations are now reporting into the CEOs. And she mentioned that she has worked at organizations where it's been sales or product and which one I think works best. I don't think it works best in sales because sales has their own agenda, and I love you guys because I know you keep the lights on, those of you in sales. But you usually have your own agenda, and that's like customer acquisition and not focused on the adoption and the actual expansion of the business because there doesn't appear to be as much there, but there actually is. Product is an interesting one because I think you do have to have a very clear product loop and that you're communicating on a regular basis. But the reality is that there's a lot of things that have to happen with a customer that don't have anything to do with a product. For instance, if you're a collections-based organization where you have to go and get somebody to pay the bill, that doesn't have anything to do with product. And so the product head doesn't have any idea how to go do that. And so it makes the most sense to me that it be aligned into the C-suite. And particularly, my most recent experience has been CRO, which handles me on the success side and then sales. And so you've got someone who understands both sides of those because they're both revenue-generating organizations. I have said this, I don't know how many times, and Nick Mehta, who's the CEO over at Gainsight, says it on a regular basis too. I do believe actually that the next batch in the next 10 to 15 years of CEOs will come from customer success. Because as I mentioned in the very beginning, you're a cat herder, you've got to understand everything about the organization. What's the marketing calendar look like and how many times are you touching my customer? Should you be touching them? From a support perspective, all the support tickets, from an invoicing perspective, from a product perspective, product marketing, and like every single organization you have to interact with to support that customer. And so I think that the next level of CEOs will even come from that because they understand all aspects as opposed to product, which is mostly product, or sales, which is mostly revenue. Yeah, I think one more time, and then we got to.
What's your thought on the CCO?
I love the CCO role, but I'll tell you that I have affectionately banged my head against lots of walls. And the reason why I say that is that a CCO is a person who's responsible for the overall customer experience, but can't be the only person who's doing it. And oftentimes, organizations will hire CCOs and think they're the only person who can make that change. But the reality is everyone on the C-suite and the board has to buy into the fact that customer experience is key and the most important thing. And so what CCOs are doing now as they walk in are beginning to understand that the rest of the C-suite goes, yeah, we in theory we believe in it, but in practice we're not going to help you. And so I'll use an example from Glassdoor. Glassdoor didn't know how to bill customers on self-serve side on credit card billing. They figured that out, but my enterprise customers could not actually pay via credit card. And so my CFO, who loved me, and I sat in his office many times because he loved me because my cost per service was really, really low, and I was trying to keep it that way. I walked in there and I said, you need a credit card billing for this. And he says, I'm not going to do it. And I'm like, why not? He goes, well, I've got all these other things to do. And I'm like, but do you know how many tickets we get and how frustrated customers are and how much collection you actually have to do because you've got a $20,000 customer who could swipe a credit card and be done and you're not doing it, yet you have it on self-service? He's like, not my business, I don't care. And so when you think about those kind of things, it's difficult to be a CCO when you're trying to get everybody to buy in on the client experience. That's honestly why I've purposely chosen not to go that route and gone into consulting, other than I can make a bigger impact in consulting, is that I don't want to be that person who's carrying the banner when there's not everybody carrying the banner with me. We'll get there. I'm confident of it, but it's probably going to be another 5 years before organizations truly understand the value of a CCO position. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me this afternoon.